Hello everyone, and welcome to the Cursed Linux and Computer Iceberg. This is an image that was posted to Reddit a couple years ago, and I'm super excited to get into it. Let me show you the full thing real quick. As you can see, the stuff at the top is only mildly concerning. The stuff at the bottom here is quite extreme. So let's get into it. At the very top, at the very first layer, we have Linus Sebastian, and our first entry, cat dev u random to see the daemons speak. So daemons are just background processes on Unix-like systems. These are things like systemd, which starts up the system, and your pulse audio, which runs your sound, stuff like that runs in the background. It connects with processes that are being run by the user, but are not directly started by the user. They're just kind of idling there to help make things keep working in the background. And obviously it's kind of a pun because it sounds like daemon, and I think that's partly intentional. So dev u random is a source of random information. Essentially, within the kernel, there are a couple different APIs that are all implemented as files in /dev and /sys and things such as, where they have information about the system stored or just sources of numbers. For example, dev0 is just a fake device that just consists entirely of zeros. So let me bring up a terminal here and show you what happens when I cat dev0, just as an example. It does nothing because apparently it's all zeros. But if I go ahead and cat dev u random, we can see the daemons are speaking indeed, and they're writing a bunch of question marks to the terminal. So that is very much a thing. There aren't actual daemons in your computer, they're just daemons. It's completely different. But you can hear them speak if you do cat dev u random. And part of the reason for this is that there is no true randomness in computers. The best we have are pseudo-random number generators, and oftentimes the way that they get that randomness is they just take a section of memory that's supposed to be unallocated, and so it's essentially like the remnants of things that used to be stored and aren't actively being looked at. FAT64 development cancellation. So FAT32, or file allocation table 32, is a file system developed by Microsoft in the 90s, and FAT16 predates it by several years. And these are all file systems that were used for DOS, the disk operating system, which predated Windows, and also for early versions of Windows. The way that these systems work is there is a table at the very top of the device that says where files are and how big they are, and that is your file allocation table. And whenever you write a file to that device, what it's actually doing is it puts the data of the file at the bottom, the next available point on the drive, and it writes onto the top of the drive where the table is what that file is called and how big it is and where it starts, essentially. FAT32 can hold files up to 2 gigabytes in size. FAT16 is prohibitively small by today's standards. But FAT64, had it ever been made, would allow for much, much larger files. However, there was no FAT64, and instead Microsoft developed a system called exFAT, which stands for extended, and exFAT has a file allocation table that's twice the size of FAT32's, and many other properties that align with the fundamental theory of a FAT64 file system, but it also does a bunch of other stuff that is really a lot different from FAT16 and FAT32. So calling it FAT64 is nice but kind of inaccurate. And that's what this is referencing, I believe. Canonical with Microsoft's secret partnership. This one was a little bit surreal to look at. At one point, this may have been a secret, but Canonical and Microsoft are indeed in partnership with each other. And I am pulling up a blog post from Microsoft, which is very creepy, because it shows that Microsoft actually certainly does like to brag about having their hands in the Linux community, and as well, Canonical is bragging about it as well nowadays. And in fact, Canonical is certainly proud to be teamed up with Microsoft. So this is just straight up true. They collaborate on stuff like Ubuntu and on Microsoft Linux, which is CBL Mariner. They also there's also Ubuntu Pro, which is a paid distro, and there is a non-insignificant amount of work that Microsoft puts into making their software work better on Canonical's platform, which is, of course, Ubuntu Linux. However, Microsoft's Linux distro, CBL Mariner, is mostly for servers, and it is Red Hat based. Windows is still just a thing. So yeah, this one is sadly very true. Apple's ARM is 68K and PowerPC combined. Okay, so it's not. To give a brief explanation, so 68K was in the 80s and late 70s. It was an alternate architecture for a CPU that predates x86 and ARM and PowerPC and stuff and such. It's an older piece of it's an older chip, and it was used in a lot of Apple and Amiga computers throughout the 80s. It runs on reduced instruction set computing, or RISC for short, which basically means that there is a set number of mathematical operations that the chip is known to be able to do to programs, and that's fixed. This is opposed to CISC, which stands for Complex Instruction Set Programming, which is what modern Intel and AMD systems use. PowerPC was another RISC architecture that was used in the 90s and very early 2000s in Apple devices before they switched their laptops and desktops to Intel architecture and their phones to ARM. They abandoned PowerPC mostly because of the power and heating requirements for it and the non-standardness of the design. But there are a couple projects that still are trying to keep it off the ground. ARM is the most popular instruction set or chip type in the world as of now, and it's used by pretty much all cell phones and also Apple's latest computers, which I actually have one of here. It was probably a bad idea to buy it, but oh well. What this theory is saying is that rather than use the actual ARM specification, Apple simply merged the software and even the hardware specs for their old ARM and their old PowerPC and their 68K software architectures. But the thing is, though, that they're literally not. It's not. This one is just not true. ARM is a known quantity. It's an instruction set. It's well documented, and it's been proven with projects like Asahi Linux that the Apple ARM chips, the new ones, do in fact use the ARM specification. They are certainly not some hypothetical fusion of 68K and PowerPC architecture instructions. However, there is a grain of truth in this one, because what Apple will do is they'll reuse the names of various software and hardware technologies when applying it to something different but sort of related. In this case, they don't have there was the old MagSafe, which was for the chargers on MacBooks, and they got rid of those when they switched to USB-C, but then they reintroduced it when they added magnets to the back of iPhones. In this case, Rosetta was the original software translation layer between PowerPC and Intel instructions, and it was added to let people use old programs on newer Macs in the early 2000s, and this was reintroduced as Rosetta 2 much more recently with the switch to Apple Silicon, which Rosetta 2 allows x86 applications to run on their new ARM system. That's about it for this one. Not literally true, but it's kind of fun to think about. Silicon Valley, funded by DoD. This one is also just straight up true, and the DoD brags about it. The DoD, by the way, stands for the Department of Defense, specifically of the United States. Silicon Valley companies don't typically advertise their defense contracts, but they are certainly being bankrolled by various branches of the U.S. government. There are agencies such as the Defense Innovation Unit, which essentially find tech companies that are doing things vaguely related to stuff that they want to be able to do, and will fund that and make it happen from the shadows. In fact, while researching for this on stream, someone came to my chat and casually mentioned that they were aware of many of these companies' names and started typing them in chat, to which YouTube deleted their message and I didn't get to see it. So this is very much a thing, and it's probably something that I should not talk about in order to not end up on any more lists. We live in a society. Installing Microsoft's programs on Linux also installs Windows. No, but also kinda. It's this one is a joke, I think. I mean, realistically, these are all meant to sound creepy, and it doesn't mean anything. I'm reading too much into it, but that's what you came here for. So let's go over how this would work and why it doesn't. The way that you run Windows programs on Linux is typically with something like Wine, which stands for Wine is not an emulator, and that is a compatibility layer uh, which runs a Windows application and translates all of the system calls that that application makes into Linux system calls and things like directory paths and such. There's also software built on top of uh, Wine, such as Proton and Play on Linux and things like Bottles, which simplify the configuration of Wine. Um, and what all these apps do is basically the same thing. They add a layer of Windows likeness onto Linux that allows Windows apps to run not knowing that they're not on Windows. And this is kind of similar. You could say that because you're emulating a Windows environment that you're running Windows. But realistically, if you were in fact running Windows, say on a virtual machine, or even if installing Microsoft software on your Linux system somehow like hijacked the install and made it Windows again, you would know from the footprint because Windows sucks. Quartz's code in Xorg. Quartz code in Xorg is the idea that some of the code in the Apple display server Quartz was in some manner copied into Xorg, which is the Linux display server, or was the Linux display server. Personally, I'm running Wayland. Quartz is proprietary, so as far as I can find, so there isn't really any concrete evidence we have that code was copied from it into Xorg. Pretty much the only way would be to know that would be if Apple sued the X.org Foundation for what would it be, copyright or trademark, or for a violation of their license, of their software license. And since that hasn't happened, we can be reasonably certain that if there is Quartz code in Xorg, it's not enough for them to take notice. Now, kind of unrelated, there is a program called Xquartz, but what that does is you run it on a Mac, and it lets you use applications that only know how to display through an X server. So it's essentially a compatibility layer similar to X Wayland, which lets X apps display on a Wayland system. Xquartz is just that, but for Quartz. And finally, for this tier, we have horizontal mouse wheel. Horizontal mouse wheel is in contrast to a vertical mouse wheel, which scrolls up and down, whereas a vertical mouse wheel scrolls up and down, a horizontal mouse wheel would scroll left and right. Now, these aren't terribly common, but they do exist. For example, here is a picture of one, and this entry is just joking about how everybody has a vertical mouse wheel, and there are so few horizontal mouse wheels, and most of them are really not presented as that big of a thing. If you can find a mouse for cheap that has a horizontal mouse wheel, I highly recommend it. It's really nice to be able to just go to the side and not have to reach over to your arrow keys like I'm doing for this effect. Now join me next week as we talk about among other things, the Stallman foot fungus psychedelics. Bye.